Thank you so much for making time to talk with us today about your campaigns for Congress. Um, we're talking with Jimmy Crumpacker and John DePaola. And I'm hoping if we can start off by having each of you just give a brief statement about who you are and why you're running. And perhaps, John, do you mind going first?
No, that's fine. And I want to thank you for the interview and also just let you know that I'm sitting in a parking lot doing this on my phone for the first time. So it's a technological breakthrough for me. I'm a retired orthopedic surgeon. I've lived in the 5th District for the last 36 years, where my wife and I raised our kids. And I retired in 2020, which gave me more time to research and investigate things that are going on with our country. And, I've always looked back. I was a blue collar guy, grew up working hard, was in a blue collar family, spent my life serving workers in Oregon. And I feel one of the reasons that I was able to succeed is there's something called the American franchise that consists of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And everybody gets one vote. So if you don't like what's going on, you can participate in democracy. And what I found in the last year and a half to 2 years since I retired was that the American franchise was not being protected as it had been in the past. In the past, no matter which party was in power, everyone agreed that the franchise was valuable. That allowed us citizens to live our life, raise our families, have a career, and not have to worry that our rights were going to be infringed upon. In the last year and a half, at a dizzying pace, the American franchise is being attacked and disassembled. And I felt that I had to step up and do something to contribute to preserving it so that my children and grandchildren will have the same benefits I had when I was growing up.
Great, thank you very much. And Jimmy, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you for having me. Yes, I'm a 7th generation Oregonian. I was born and raised in the 5th District, as were my parents and my grandfather. So I'm actually 4th generation in this 5th District. I went to Georgetown University, where I studied government and actually worked for Gordon Smith as an intern. And I was actually going to go right into government service right then, but a very smart woman told me that people in government don't know economics, they don't know business, so they said go into business first. So I moved to New York and worked in the energy business for 13 years. And then moved back to Oregon about 10 years ago. And when I moved back, I got very involved in the community. The first thing I did was start delivering for Meals on Wheels. I delivered over 5,000 meals over the course of 6 years and sat on their board and was very proud that they delivered roughly 1.3 million meals a year during my tenure on the board. Then I also got on the board. I was asked to join the board of Oregon Ballet Theater, which was close to bankruptcy. I became the treasurer within my first year on the board, ran the largest surplus there, and then became the youngest chair of the board. And when I left as chair of the board, we had over half of our budget in cash, which I was very proud of. I was also asked to join the board of the Portland Japanese Garden, and was there when we built the $37.5 million addition. And it's one of the biggest tourist attractions and biggest drivers of economic growth for tourists in the region. So I was very proud of the community work I did. And when the opportunity presented itself to run for office, I jumped at it. So here we are.
Great. Thanks very much. And what we'll do is just alternate who goes first on which questions. So Jimmy, if you wouldn't mind starting off with this, what would be your priorities if you were elected to this position?
My top priority right at the beginning would be to deal with inflation. What we are seeing in the energy space and in food costs. I've heard numbers of $300 per month for an average family of 4 year over year of energy and food prices. That I've actually heard yesterday that number might be up to $5,500 a year now. So inflation is critical. We need to get that under control to get the economy back in line. And then, I think energy independence is critical. That was my business for a long time. I think not having to rely on foreign powers, as we're seeing right now with the war in Russia and Ukraine, is critical. I would also like to do as much as I can to contain the forest fires, which have gone wildly out of control. And the 5th District, especially the Deschutes County part of the district, is directly affected by that. So right off the top, those are 3 issues. But there are numerous others that I would be willing to discuss, but I know our time's limited.
Great, thank you. And John, how about you? What would be your top priorities?
Well, I agree with Jimmy. First of all, let me say, Jimmy, I love the Japanese garden, and it's just one of my favorite places, so thank you. I also agree with him that inflation is a definite problem. I think when we address environmental concerns in Oregon, it must involve our forestry management, water management, and our energy infrastructure. So I totally agree with Jim on those. But the thing that has really gotten my attention is our children and how they have been adversely impacted recently by, first of all, the curriculum that's being taught in our public schools, which includes CRT, the 1619 project, and also.
So let me stop you there. You're saying that those are being taught in the schools that, for instance, your grandchildren are going to right now?
Yes.
So
yes.
in what manner? So they're actually, they have the 1619 project, or
I would say I haven't heard as much about the 1619 project as I've heard about CRT.
And what is critical race theory?
Critical race theory, from my understanding, is that people are determined their position in society based on their skin color or their race, and that certain segments of our society would be the oppressed and the other segments of society would be the oppressor. So this is what I understand that means.
And that is based on, and this is kind of what you're gathering, that kids are being taught in school?
Yes, and the thing that is most disturbing to me is that there is gender re-education going on in our children's schools, starting at the kindergarten and grade school level, where young children are being given information and instruction about sexual issues and lifestyle choices that really have no business being introduced into the school for very, very young children who are not prepared or to address those things.
I guess I would, and maybe this is the better question. Why is Congress, if those are your concerns, if you're seeing specific things in your children's school or your grandchildren's schools, why is Congress the place for you to go?
Well, I am not running because I want a new career. I've had a great career. I have never wanted to be a politician, and I wanted to get involved in national politics because that's where I feel I can have the greatest influence on the direction of our country. So the parents' issues, I know, are determined at the local and state level as far as education. But I believe as a leader, I have a position where I can be a person of influence. And so I am very, very tuned into our children. And in addition, the COVID restrictions have had a big impact on children. I feel like a lot of what's going on in our society now are issues that are disproportionately affecting our children.
I apologize, I did interrupt you. Were there other priorities beyond what you've discussed that you wanted to, that would be important to you as a congressperson?
Well, I think one of the focuses of all Congress people should be on our impact on the environment. And so I feel that as a congressman, I can influence policies that affect our federal forests and our energy policy, which of course has diverse impacts in other areas of our economy and of our national security and other things.
Great, thank you. And so I think you would be first on this next question, and that is, what can and should Congress do about inflation?
Well, first of all, we have to restore our energy independence. Energy independence is critical to national security, and it's also critical to our economy, to reestablish our supply chains, and to run our industries, to allow small businesses to function and not be overburdened with excessive costs related to energy issues that impact their ability to make a profit.
Okay, thank you. Jimmy, what about you? You had mentioned inflation would be a priority. What can and should Congress do to reverse that?
The number one thing they can do is get their budgets under control. The amount of money that the administration has spent over the last year has been directly driving inflation. What we've seen last year in the second quarter, year over year, our port throughput was up 16%. So that's a huge number, which means there's a lot of products being imported. And if you look at the same numbers comparatively in the European Union, it was about 1%. So the United States is directly responsible for a lot of this inflation that's been pushed out of the federal government through checks that have been given to the American people. And with a $30 trillion deficit right now, it's very hard for us to control that. The deficit when Kurt Schrader came into office, for example, was only at $8 trillion. So, over the last 14 years, we've had a huge increase. So from the perspective of getting spending under control, I think that's the number one thing that we can do to try and decrease inflation. And, from a congressional standpoint, you don't have control over the Fed, but certainly you can ask questions of members of the Fed when they come to testify and get their reasons for running loose monetary policy. So those are things where you can have a direct influence on inflation. And your cat just jumped up behind you. I tried not to get distracted.
I apologize.
No.
Usually I put her outside, but then she cries the whole time. So I was hoping she'd be here.
And I'm hoping my dog doesn't interrupt. Entirely possible.
You did bring up and actually, Jimmy, you would go first on this. What is wrong with Kurt Schrader as the representative for Congressional District 5? Why do you think he's not doing a good enough job and needs to be replaced?
Yeah, no, there are a number of issues. He's been in lockstep with the administration on a lot of these issues as far as inflation. And as far as the administration, pre-war with Russia and Ukraine limiting energy, our drive towards energy independence. His tenure, unfortunately, it doesn't appear to me as though he has been the best at constituent services. When you take all of August recess to ride your horses across the country on vacation, as opposed to being there in your district working with your constituents, it just makes me question how much he wants the job. So I think it's important to have balance in the federal delegation. With only one Republican, it really puts us on the outs when the Republicans are in the majority. So there are a number of issues that I think are relevant, but we don't even know if he's going to be the nominee, to be quite frank with you.
Right. John, how about you? What do you think of the job that Representative Schrader's been doing? And do you think he needs to be replaced?
Well, I definitely think he needs to be replaced. The thing that I'm most upset with Mr. Schrader about is the fact that he hasn't responded to situations going on in our state. He has not stepped in, used his voice to engage in the public dialogue about the crime, drug use, homelessness, all things that he could influence uh, by taking a stand on our border security, because people are coming to the border. It's not a humane thing. Women and young girls come to the border, they're raped, they're enslaved, and they're trafficked right up I-5 and 97 right into our 5th district. And these young girls, some of them end up on the streets. Some of them end up being inducted into the pornography industry, and some of them are abused or killed. And so I think that he had a role to play in preventing that. There's also labor slavery, which occurs when men come across the border and they pay coyotes to transport them across the border, and then they have to pay the coyotes back. And so they're under the control of these folks while they're here in the United States. So they're not coming here and getting freedom. They're coming here and being enslaved and abused. And we've all heard about women that have suffered abuse and how they never really recover from that. And it's always something that affects them for the rest of their lives. So it gives them a worse life, not a better life. And he has been completely absent on that. He's not raised his voice. He's not raised his voice about the energy problems that we're having because of this focus on the fossil fuel industry, when in fact we are the most responsible nation on the planet when it comes to using fossil fuels and managing the environmental impact of that. He should not have let that degrade. He should not let that affect our military readiness. I think there's just so many issues with Kurt Schrader not doing things. He's not taking action. He's not getting involved where he should be getting involved, and his focus should be on the people of Oregon and their needs and their lifestyle, and not on his party or on his career.
Great. And John, this question would be for you to start off with. You've both mentioned energy independence. What does building an energy independence mean in your view?
Well, you know, our life, our modern existence is so dependent on the use of fossil fuels and you know, those petroleum products, which we make our clothing, our drugs, our furniture, our motor vehicles, our plastics. All of these things require a petroleum-based energy infrastructure, and also our military. So we cannot suddenly withdraw our ability to maintain our energy independence when we don't have something to immediately replace it that is just as powerful and just as reliable. And so what is happening under the current administration is they're rushing to disassemble our energy infrastructure, and they don't have anything to replace it. The other issue regarding the petroleum industry is it is an extraction based industry. They extract things from our earth and then they use it to make products. Well, the new energy infrastructure that's being promoted involves the extraction of lithium and rare metals, which is every bit as destructive to the environment and impacts critical things like our water supply, which there is a big lithium deposit in Southern Oregon that they're discussing mining, but there's also a tremendous water shortage in the eastern and southern part of our state. And so you can't switch to an energy infrastructure that kills your farming industry and kills all the salmon and all the conservation efforts we've been making. So I think their energy policy is misdirected, and I think that we can do it in a more sustainable way, and we can do it in such a way that it restores our industry, or particularly our timber and lumber industries, and restores the vitality of our agribusinesses in Oregon.
Do you have any specific ideas with regards to how you would do that?
Well, first of all, I think the forests need to be managed in such a way that they don't catch on fire and are destroyed and spew carbon into our atmosphere every summer. The forests are healthier if they're maintained, because having control over the size of the trees and the density of the forest can make for a healthier environment. And I certainly believe that if there are species that are at risk, that we can mitigate our efforts in order to sustain those species without halting all of our efforts altogether. The other thing that people are maybe unaware of is that in the Western United States, up to 60% of the water that we use is for lawns, and that we use pesticides on our lawns and herbicides that are carcinogenic and go into our water table. So if we can change the way people think about their lived environment and incorporate more native and indigenous species that don't require the water and the fertilizer, that would go a long way to sustaining our water supply. And we may even be able to reverse some of these droughts that we're experiencing. Also, these pesticides are very toxic to pollinators. So we have bees, and everyone is, well, I can't say everyone, that's a generality, but there's a lot of discussion about the loss of bee population and the impact that the lack of pollinators is going to have on our agricultural business across the country. And what we're doing when we build spaces, we destroy the habitat of the pollinators, and then we use pesticides which kill the pollinators. But we can rethink and restore our lived environment, and the Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy and other organizations have programs where they've already figured out, based on your zip code, what you could do on your property to restore more biodiversity and have a healthier environment. So I think there needs to be a focus on that. And I could go on, obviously, for a while on that, but thank you.
Thank you. And Jimmy, how about you in terms of what is your view of energy independence? What would that look like for the U.S.?
Yeah, so we have basically become energy independent if you include Mexico and Canada. But I think the priority of the administration of Congress should really be on building more pipelines. Unfortunately, we're flaring a lot of natural gas throughout the Midwest because we don't have the infrastructure to get it out. When you're moving oil on trains or on trucks, that's just simply not the most efficient way to do it. So I think building more pipelines would be really helpful. And then as far as being energy independent, I think that nuclear is something that we need to get back into. If you look at France, they get roughly 70% of their energy from the nuclear industry, and the industry has made huge strides over the last 50 years since we basically come out of the heyday of building nuclear power plants in the United States. And I think that this is something that would be critical. We can build small nuclear stations that only need to be fueled once every 10 years, and they can sustain cities of 50,000 people. If we moved in that direction, it would really take us out of being reliant on countries that don't have our best interests at hand. Some of the largest oil producers in the world, the Russias, the Saudi Arabias, Iran, Venezuela. These are not countries that have our best interests at heart. And with oil prices where they are right now, that's when these countries can cause the most damage.
do you see wind or solar as part of that mix?
Yeah, wind and solar are good, but they're not 100% reliable, right? So, if you look at certain areas of the country where wind is huge and solar are works, they still have nuclear power plants. I look at somewhere like in Southern California that has high winds and a lot of sun, but they still have to turn on, or sorry, I meant to say natural gas power plants. They still have to turn on natural gas power plants. So, those industries, as long as there aren't huge subsidies, I'm fine with that. If anything that works that private industry can pay for is good.
Great. Laura, do you want to ask a few questions?
I do. So remind me, are we starting? Is it Jimmy's turn to lead off the questions? I didn't keep track of the ping pong. All right, Jimmy, I just wanted to follow up. In your candidate survey, you didn't answer part of question number 5. And so I wanted to follow up with you on that. The question was, what is your view of the January 6th insurrection? And do you support the congressional investigation into the day's events?
January 6th was really sad. I was disappointed, quite frankly. Unfortunately, the loss of life, and especially in our nation's capital, I think was very disappointing. As far as the congressional investigation, it worries me that it's become political, and a political witch hunt. And I think that as we've seen, the courts are taking on people that they think have done things that are illegal.
What would you have proposed for a different way to handle it that wouldn't be political in terms of the investigation?
I don't know what the other options are. It does seem as though it's become a political witch hunt, though.
Okay, John, I'm going to ask you also to kind of follow up on that same question. In your survey, you wrote that they concluded that our election system was very insecure and had many problems that needed to be addressed in going forward. And this was in regards to our elections. That was a 2-part question in the survey. But I'm curious, none of the inquiries launched after.
Oh. Laura, I think you're freezing up, unfortunately.
Yeah, I lost you a little bit there, Laura.
She may need to drop and come back on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm sorry. I live out in rural Oregon and have very, very limited bandwidth on some days. I'm sorry. So I'll just repeat the whole question. I'm sorry. So the second part of the question, our survey, John, you had answered it by saying, quote, they concluded that our election system was very insecure and had many problems that needed to be addressed going forward. That was in relation to the election security. But I'm curious, none of the inquiries launched after legal action found anything questionable about the results of the 2020 election. So I'm curious, what can you point to specifically that would justify the cost of your idea, which is forensic audits after every election?
Well, Laura, I would have to say it's not really my idea. The whole issue of election security and the use of voting machines and different devices to manage our voting system has been criticized for the last at least 10 years in the press. PBS, CBS, NBC have all had investigations. Other print media have investigated it. And in 2018, there was a investigation by the Democratic Party in both the House and the Senate involving many personalities that we all know, Senator Wyden, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, and others, who, after their investigation, found that our voting machines were hackable, that they could be hacked by a teenager, that they were not secure, that votes could be miscounted or shifted either during or after the election, that the voting machines are connected to the internet, which makes them vulnerable. And the conclusion that Senator Wyden came up with is that we should have paper ballots, and he called them risk limiting audits. And I looked that up, and I don't think risk limiting is sufficient. But I think the solution is not technology. There's some things that we've seen in our society that are not made better by technology, but they're made more vulnerable or worse. And our election system is one of them. We should have paper ballots. Election day should be a holiday. It should be on a Monday. We should be certain that the precincts are small enough so that people don't have to be in long lines, so they have to have access, and that people show up in person with an ID that confirms that they are a US citizen, not that they just registered a car at the DMV. And they have to produce evidence of their citizenship, and they cast their votes. I think that the introduction of computer technology into the election system has been a tragedy for our nation, because people don't trust the electoral system, the election system anymore. And I'll just make reference to your comment about how you made some comment about how there have been investigations and there's been no evidence that there's been a problem with the elections. I think that's not accurate. I think there have been investigations that have showed hundreds of thousands of irregularities that have occurred in our elections, both in 2016 and 2020, and that is not acceptable. We can't have hundreds of thousands of irregularities occurring. And the other issue is the very same personalities or the very same party that promoted the idea that we needed audits is now blocking progress on any attempt to make an audit. So I think everybody's just got to agree the system's not perfect. There's room for improvement, and we've learned through experience that certain things don't work, and we need to restore trust in our election system, excuse me.
So just a quick follow-up on that, and you can answer yes or no. So you're saying that you disagree with Oregon's mail-in ballot system, that you don't support our mail-in ballot system in Oregon?
I do not support it in its current form.
Thank you. Hey, I also wanted to ask you both of you mentioned in your introductions and in the first question, you both made references to federal forests in Oregon. Starting with you, John, I'm curious, living in Oregon, living in an area of the state that is highly flammable as well. I know that there's a lot of folks arguing that a lack of management in Oregon's federal forests have made our wildfire seasons more destructive and more deadly. I'm curious what you think on that issue and how you think it should be addressed.
Well, and depending on what you read and when it was written, that there is a large portion of the forests in Oregon that are not privately owned. They're owned by state or federal government. And there's difficulty in establishing a comprehensive forest management system in our state. And what I understand, and I'm doing research on this now, is that when a contract is drawn up for forestry management or use of the forest, that lawsuits are launched that block any progress on these things. There are sustainable harvesting methods, but because the private sector owns so little of the forest, when our lumber and timber industry log the forest, they have a small area of forest to maintain, so they have a low inventory, and the most financially feasible way to log is a clear cut. But if we can find a way to establish a policy where we can make progress and have all of our forests accessible for sustainable logging, then clear cutting on small pieces of land and cutting down all the trees wouldn't be necessary for our industry to be viable. They would have more inventory, and the other issue is the private forests. They have very good infrastructure. They have good roads. They abide by the responsible logging companies abide by all of the EPA requirements and to sustain our rivers and the health of the forest. But I think that the government-owned forests have fewer roads for access. So once there's a fire, the roads aren't maintained. You can't get people and equipment in to fight the fire, so the fires get out of control. The other issue is that there isn't a response to a fire till it gets to be a certain size. And I think that we need to develop some sort of a forestry corps or some method of almost like the military, sending helicopters in, dropping people in to fight these small outbreaks of fire so they don't become bigger fires. So I think there's just a lot of things we can do. We've got to get together. Both sides of the aisle need to get together and agree that this is necessary to restore our environment so that our forests are more effective in cleaning the air and retaining the water, cooling the earth. And it's also very important to restore our rural communities, which have been decimated because they don't have tax revenue from logging activities to sustain their schools and their streets and infrastructure and their government. So I think this gridlock over logging is not only bad for the environment, it's bad for Oregonians. And I think we need to make a change.
Just a quick follow-up on that in terms of when there are efforts to go in and log either for federal forest lands or private. Oregon has laws about where logging can occur near waterways, creeks, and other water that runs through forests. Do you think that the protections that are right now in place for those waterways are sufficient, or they should be larger?
I think if we have a higher volume of less logged forestry areas, that it's going to be better overall. I do not know the details of the current restrictions on how far from a waterway they have to be, but I think all that needs to be looked at, and we need to look at in the context of being able to use more of the forest, and also in methodologies that we can use to improve our water as well. So I think it's worthwhile looking into it. I'm not expert enough to comment on specific regulations at this time.
Okay, thank you. Jimmy, I asked the question of you. Do you want me to restate it if my bandwidth lets me, or are you still following along on that?
If you could restate it, that would be wonderful. Thanks.
It's been a while. Many have argued that a lack of management in the federal forests that take up a great deal of Oregon's land have in part made our annual wildfire seasons much more destructive and deadly. And I'm just curious whether you agree with that, and if so, how you think that issue should be addressed.
Yes. Okay. That is a great question. I look back at when I was a kid, we had 85,000 timber workers in the state of Oregon. Now we have 25,000. And what that means is we have 60,000 less people that are managing the forest, meaning if a small fire sparked up in the early 80s, you had so many people in the forest that those fires were put out very quickly because at the end of the day, people in the timber industry care deeply about protecting the timber. So because 53% of the state of Oregon is managed by the federal government, we're talking about 32 million acres. Unfortunately, the federal government is just not pulling its weight when it comes to fighting the forest fires. Part of that is the fact that the Forest Service budget has been cut by 75%. And, a lot of that's due to the fact that they're not making as much money with their timber sales as they used to. So in my opinion, we do need to get back into the forests as quickly as possible. And there are methods that have proven to be very effective. You saw the forest fire in Southern Oregon this last summer that burned 400,000 acres. There were certain sections that had been managed. They'd been thinned, the underbrush had been taken out, and those sections of the forests were damaged much less than the sections that had not been treated at all. So there are methods that are highly effective, and at the end of the day, this is the federal government's responsibility. And if you look at the effects the forest fires have, especially in I look at Bend, and our air quality index, our AQI last summer was the worst in the world. And that really affects senior citizens. It affects pregnant women, and it deeply affects tourism. And Oregon has become a huge tourism economy in the summer. But if you bring your family of 4 to Oregon, and all you have is smoke for an entire week, you're going to go back home and tell people not to go to Oregon. So this is something that we need to control, and the damage that it is causing to the environment is devastating.
Great, thank you. Jimmy, let's see. I think you're first on this. And what should be the federal government's next step, or what should be the next step in the federal government's COVID response at this point in the pandemic? Right now, you have a lot of wrangling over a new package to fund tests, vaccines, therapeutics, et cetera. Where do you see what would be the appropriate response for the federal government at this point?
Boy, I thought we were done with COVID, so, I'm hoping we're done with it. I really would hope that the federal government would no longer be spending money on COVID. That's an area that I personally think that, we can cut down on, because, the federal deficit is out of control. So I wouldn't be for spending any more money.
So in terms of the current, I think now it's talked about as being possibly 10 billion for test, therapeutics, vaccines. You would not be voting for that.
No, not at this point.
Okay. And John, how about you? What is your position on what the government's response should be at this point for COVID?
Well, the COVID response has been grossly mismanaged. We have been subject to arbitrary mandates and proclamations from bureaucrats and politicians, and the medical and research community has been marginalized in favor of a bureaucracy. And in the beginning, I took the vaccine. I was still a practicing surgeon, and the fact of the matter is they wouldn't let me in the hospital unless I had a vaccine. So in order to maintain my ability to generate an income and take care of my patients, I had to get a vaccine. And since then, I've learned that these are not vaccines in the traditional sense. And they are what would be more termed gene therapy. And they work using genetic material and putting it in people's bodies where it replicates and generates some form of a response, but that response is short-lived. It's vaccines. So the definition of a vaccine is that it stops the person from getting the disease or spreading the disease. Now, these new drugs that they put out on the market do neither of those two things. They say only that it may reduce hospitalizations and death. Well, right after the start of the COVID situation, a group of very highly respected doctors put out a document called the Barrington Declaration, and they said, well, we shouldn't shut down the whole economy. We should only focus on those people most at risk, which would be elderly people, and particularly those in nursing homes or who are ill with other significant diseases. And otherwise, we should go about life, and we should consider using off-label medications. And they recommended two, which are ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, both of which are some of the safest medications that have ever been developed in the history of medicine. To say those drugs are dangerous after they've been used on men, women, children, pregnant women, elderly, well people, sick people for decades with no significant adverse effects would be the same as saying, well, we've decided that aspirin and Tylenol are dangerous and nobody should take them because if you take them in toxic doses, they can hurt you. And so they have not been straightforward in addressing that issue. I think as a result of that, many people were instructed not to get treatment, but to wait at home until their symptoms got bad enough, and when they couldn't breathe, to go to the hospital. And of course, a person who has a health condition that is deteriorated to that level, the likelihood of them surviving is very low. So I think there's so much confusion, especially since they changed the definition of the cause of death. And they indicate that anybody who has COVID while they are hospitalized for something other than COVID need to be classified as a COVID death. And so a lot of the COVID deaths that are recorded are people who died with COVID and not of COVID. So everything is very confused because scientific principles and methods were not followed right from the beginning. And so now we have unreliable data, and we're getting.
So I would like to kind of really kind of focus it back on just, what should their response be at this point in the pandemic? And maybe even more specifically, like, would you support additional funding for tests, vaccines, therapeutics?
No, I would not. And I would recommend that we, when we get to Congress, that we reevaluate the bureaucracy of our public health sector and replace bureaucrats and people with conflicts of interest with scientists who have a good reputation and have no conflicts of interest.
Let's see. This question is for you, John. Neither of you actually supported the Build Back Better plan. I'm wondering if there were any elements in it that you found would be worth pursuing.
I think I indicated that there was a section that addressed forest management, and I think it's pretty clear I support forest management. I didn't really look at the details of exactly how they were going to carry that out and what it would cost, but I think our country needs traditional infrastructure, roads, bridges, airports, internet in our rural areas, and anything else that's in the bill should not be considered or funded until we get the essential things we need to maintain our status as a modern country, and then we can look at other issues.
Okay. And Jimmy, same question for you. Were there any elements of the Build Back Better plan that you found compelling or should be pursued?
Certainly their infrastructure, forest management, those are things that I could support. The reason I didn't want to support it is because I didn't think that our economy could take it right now. And I think we're seeing the effects of that. And I don't think it's going to slow down anytime soon. Inflation at this level is very dangerous. And if you consider that it's really a tax, especially on the people that can afford it least, this is not when the federal government should be going out with huge spending packages, in my opinion. It really hurts, the people at the bottom. If you look at people in the bottom 20% of the income bracket, they spend post-tax 29% on energy, meaning their car and filling their car. And, when energy prices double in a year, that has a huge impact. So it's hard for me to say, yes, the federal government should be passing huge spending bills when this is the effect of that.
But there have been other elements as well. For instance, Medicare would be empowered to negotiate insulin prices with drug manufacturers, and a number of other drugs as well would also fall on that list. Isn't that kind of is that something that you think the federal government should be doing, is looking into how to address or control or in some way negotiate down the prices that are paid for some of these drugs?
That's a slippery slope. Whenever the government puts its thumb on the economy, that can be dangerous. But certainly, I would like to have lower drug prices. So that's a very hard issue because I believe in limited government. But at the same time, we don't want our seniors paying through the nose.
Let's see. And John, how about you? Is there, just in terms of the Medicare component or the drug component, is there some aspect that you feel that the federal government should be taking a larger role in negotiating or addressing some of the spiraling costs of prescriptions?
I think in the prescription medicine segment, there needs to be some intervention, but I share Jimmy's concerns that the government can be heavy-handed and actually make things worse instead of making them better. So I would be very careful before supporting any specific legislation that would impact drug prices.
And let's see, John, for you, would you support lifting the limitation on the deduction for state and local taxes that was initially adopted during the Trump tax changes?
Well, personally, that didn't have a very nice effect on me. So I think that the SALT is something that should not be part of the tax legislation. I think there's other avenues that could be pursued because people end up getting taxed twice. Generally, I'm against anybody getting taxed twice for the same revenue, and it happens throughout our tax code. And I think it has a dampening effect on our economy because it's taking money away from the people and away from business, which is where all the productivity and the consumption is. So that's really the engine of our government. And it puts it in the federal government or the state government where it doesn't really accomplish anything. Those are not productive entities. So I would like to see all double taxation eliminated.
Okay. And Jimmy, same question for you. Would you support reversing that limitation that was adopted as part of the Trump tax law?
I would not support reversing that, no.
Okay. And can you explain?
I thought that it was fair. And they basically, what they tried to do was clean up the tax code. And I think that is a good thing to do. I think, if you look at our tax policy, it is incredibly complicated. And I think simplifying the code would be beneficial for everyone.
Okay, great. I think I'm pretty much all set. Did anyone else want to jump in with anything? No? Okay, great. Well, thank you both for being with us today. I really appreciate it. I'll be in touch if we have any further questions. And you're free to follow up if there's anything else that you wanted to add or if you needed anything more. But thanks very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Okay.
Thank you.
Will this video be accessible to